Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Sneakers Corner again, and I'm delighted to have Paul Ellis, who's a friend of the channel, on with us this evening. And perhaps, Paul, you want to introduce your topic today. It's kind of obvious, I suppose, from the title, Masjid Al Haran, but would you like to introduce?
Yes, the Masjid Al Haran is very important in the Quran, and the traditional Islamic narrative has it in Mecca. I think there are very few people now who really believe that in the revisionist community who really believe that's the case. I would like to propose that it's in Jerusalem. It refers to Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Now, I first came across your ideas, I think it probably about 2 months ago. You left a longish comment on one of our videos, and I was really impressed with the quality of your research and your argument for Jerusalem being the location of the Masjid Al Haran. So this is really the first time I got the opportunity really to bring you on and share your thesis with everyone. And I think everyone will really appreciate all of your hard work here. So hand it back to you, and away you go.
Okay. Well, the Masjid Al Haran literally means Masjid means a place of prostration. It comes from the verb sajid, to bend down, to prostrate oneself. It's often got a religious connotation. And Al Haram, the word haram, I think is fairly well known. It means forbidden. It's often rendered in translations as a sacred place. But I would suggest that that's an attempt to try and explain away the word. I'll have an alternative explanation as to why it is a forbidden place of prostration. It's mentioned in the Quran in these verses here that you see on the screen. It's also in Surah 2:196. The same place is also referred to as the house. In 17:1, it's referred to as my house, speaking as God, because it's God talking in the Quran. In God's voice, he's saying, this is my house. Similarly, in Surah 22, verse 25, and in 22:29, it is called the ancient house.
Yeah.
We'll see some more houses coming along in a moment. Surah 125 doesn't use the phrase Masjid Al Haram, but it does say my house, God's house, and also refers to the same place with a bit more information. It calls it the station of Abraham.
Interesting, yeah.
And the station of Abraham, or the standing place of Abraham, is also referred to in Surah 3, verse 97. You need to have a bit of a map. This is how to read the Quran. You've got to have a bit of a mental map out there, or pen and paper to try and follow the links.
Yeah.
And the verse before 397, which of course is 396, and clearly refers to the same place, that tells us a little bit more about it. It says it's the first place created for mankind at Bakar, and also refers to it as the forbidden house, quite similar to the forbidden place of prostration.
Yeah.
A final couple of references to it don't use any of these terms, but it's clearly the same place, and that's 595 and 597, which refer to the sacred house, and intriguingly refer to it also as the Kaaba, meaning the cube. So what we have is a place, a single place. It occurs in many verses of the Quran, mainly in the later chapters. There's no reference to it at all in the early surahs. Virtually all except one of these is traditionally regarded as a Medinan surah. But it's referred to as a Masjid Al Haram, various types of houses, the forbidden house, the house, my house, the ancient house, the sacred house, and then the first house created for mankind at Bakar, also called the Station of Abraham and the Kaaba. So a few clues to work with there. Why is it important? Well, it is important. Oh, sorry, how important is it? It's very important. Believers are told that they must face towards it when they pray. I won't read out all the verses. You can see them on the screen. Believers are told that they have to make a pilgrimage there. That's a command from God. Very important. It was a departure point for something described as a night journey. And the night journey took the person making the journey, the Quran author, from the Masjid Al Haran to the furthest mosque, wherever that is. It is also a place from which the Quranic community had been expelled and which they were ordered to fight to regain. Those verses there. Arguably, it's an instruction that has altered. Well, it certainly is an instruction that has altered human history, where it is that they've been fighting to regain. But arguably, it's a fight that's still going on now. So very important to know where this place is.
Yeah.
It's a place that God had promised them that they would enter. So God promised them victory in this fight. And God seems to have fulfilled that promise, because it's a place where they made a treaty in Surah 9:7, and a place from where they were eventually able to exclude their opponents in Surah 9, verse 28, which may or may not be the people who had expelled them to begin with.
Good.
So I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that the Masjid Al Haran is the focus of the Quran community's spiritual landscape. It's something practical, somewhere they've been, somewhere they're fighting to get back into, and the place they pray towards. It really does dominate their spiritual landscape. Now, what does the Quran tell us about it? Does it give us any more information beyond these names I mentioned before? Yes, it tells us that Abraham and Ishmael raised the foundations of the house in Surah 2:127. So a place that's built by Abraham and Ishmael. Also, where Abraham said in Surah 14, verse 37, "Lord, I have settled some of my progeny in a valley without cultivation by thy sacred house." So it's got a strong Abrahamic connection.
Yeah.
The instructions about the pilgrimage, tell the person, obviously, that they must take the pilgrimage there. Also give a little bit of information. It talks about do not shave your heads until the offering reaches the place of sacrifice. So we know it's a place of sacrifice, and presumably it's an animal. No reference of human sacrifice, so it's probably an animal sacrifice takes place during this pilgrimage.
Yeah.
It's connected to the new moon, Surah 2:189. It is said that the moon is a marker for the Hajj. And a cryptic reference, which you and I discussed online in the past, 2:158. It says, "There is no harm in the rituals of Safa and Marwa," but frustratingly doesn't tell us what the rituals of Safa and Marwa are, leaving ample scope for imagination.
Classic Islamic ambiguity.
These two themes, Abraham, the Abrahamic connection, and the pilgrimage, both come together in Surah 22, verse 26. "And remember when we assigned for Abraham the place of the house," and then goes into a quoted speech, "Ascribe unto me no partners, and purify my house for those who circumambulate, and for those who stand, and those who bow and prostrate." So during this pilgrimage, they circumambulate, they go round, they circle this house. Those last few words there, I've always assumed, as I've been looking at this, that those are the reasons why Muslims do their daily prayers, or their 5 daily prayers, as they do those spiritual exercises, to stand, to bow and prostrate. They, I think, come from Surah 22:26.
Yeah.
Well, the traditional Islamic narrative is, of course, that this is Mecca. Let's have a look at how they literally square that with the with some of the information. It's a forbidden place of prostration. It's God's house, a cube. Foundations made by Abraham and Ishmael. Abraham settled his progeny nearby. And it's associated with a Hajj pilgrimage, with animal sacrifice, circumambulation, and Safa and Marwa. Well, Muslims believe, or it is one tradition, is that Mecca lies directly beneath paradise, and that therefore this is where Adam and Eve descended. I'm not quite sure how they descended, but when they came down, there was a vertical descent, and they landed in Mecca, which is directly underneath paradise, and that it is said explains why it's the first house. Mecca, it is said, or that's just another word for Mecca, which is the Arabic name for Mecca. The Abrahamic connection is that the story is that Hagar, who was Abraham's wife, Sarah's servant woman, and who gave birth to Abraham's elder son, Ishmael, that Hagar took Ishmael there as a baby. She took him from Canaan, where they were living, and took him down to Arabia, what's now Saudi Arabia, and Mecca. And that years later, when Ishmael was a grown man, when Abraham was a grown man. No, I was right. When Ishmael was a grown man, Abraham came down from Canaan, and he found them, and they had a reunion, and Abraham and Ishmael did a bit of father-son bonding and built a house, the original Kaaba. That was a theist Abrahamic shrine, but later the Arabs became corrupt, they became pagans, and it became a pagan pilgrimage destination with plenty of statues and icons and pagan gods there. I have to say that the notion that Mecca lies directly below paradise is how can I put this? I'm religious myself, and I hesitate to call anybody else's religious beliefs ridiculous, because I know how people would look at me and my religion. So I hesitate. But the idea that the heaven is not only a real place, but is a place that is spinning around the earth, it simply makes no sense to me at all. I think this is a hopeless attempt to try and explain the phrase "the first house."
Yeah.
Baka and Mecca, the change to the B to the M makes it a completely different word. I have a theory about Baka and Mecca, but as I've discussed with Mel before, but perhaps I'll save that for another time. The story of Hagar and Ishmael. Why? Why would Hagar have taken her young baby Ishmael from Canaan in a fertile valley 600 miles down to the Hijaz? No explanation is provided. Was somebody chasing her? Was Sarah, pursuing her in some way? Were they looking for something? Were they looking for the spot underneath heaven? No explanation is given. It really makes you can see why the story is there, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, totally implausible.
Yes, but implausible isn't really the biggest problem, because it's religion. Lots of implausible things can happen in religion. That's not the problem. It's why. What is the reason? What's the internal logic? Religion should have some kind of purpose. Something should tie in, should follow on from something, should have a meaning. This seems to have no meaning other than to explain something that can't be explained any other way.
Yeah.
And the pagan shrine, I won't go into this in much detail, because it's been exhaustively covered by very many people, from Tom Holland to Dan Gibson. Although still my favorite is by Jay Smith, I have to say. There is no evidence of Mecca's existence before 700, 741, in fact.
I'd agree with you.
And in fact, it's not simply an argument from silence. Peter Townsend wrote a book called The Meccan Mystery, in which he meticulously goes through all the people who should have talked about Mecca, people who walked past it, people who were mapping the area around it. We know it wasn't there.
Yeah.
So, it's not Mecca. I'm going to propose that it was Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And I shall give you five reasons. Let's start with the Abraham connection. In Genesis, chapter 2, and then later on in chapter 9, it refers to Abraham building an altar on Mount Moriah, upon which he was going to sacrifice his other son, Isaac. So you see the quote there, and God said, "Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." And then that's chapter 2 and then chapter 9. And they came to the place that God told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Later on in 2 Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 1, it describes Solomon building the first temple on Temple Mount, and it is described as taking place on Mount Moriah, in the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. A bit of a mouthful there, but you see the point. They both take place on Mount Moriah, or at least in the land of Moriah on a mountain. So anyone reading the Torah, or not the Torah, anyone reading the Hebrew Bible would look at this and form the conclusion that the temple was built on the very spot where Abraham had prepared to sacrifice his son. Yep. Secondly, the cube. You see the place referred to twice as a cube. Well, of course, the one in Mecca looks a bit cubic, but that was built much later. What can we say about the cube? Well, we have to go into temple design for this. In Exodus, describes in some detail the tabernacle in the wilderness. This is when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and he gives all the dimensions of the tent. And as you see, there's an enclosure there, and then there's an oblong tent, and the Holy of Holies is a cubic area at the end of that tent, and that is where they keep the Ark of the Covenant and various other items, and the Ten Commandments. There's not actually a killer quote to sum up that it's a cube. I got that from my Bible encyclopedia. I think you need to read the whole text and do some mathematics and plot it out on a bit of paper to work out that it's a cube. But that is what I understand. Yeah. 1 Kings 6:20 talks about Solomon's temple, which I referred to before. Obviously a much grander affair. And in this case, there's no doubt that it follows a similar sort of shape for the Holy of Holies. And again, we have a cube at the end. You see there in 6:20, 1 Kings 6:20, it says, "The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high."
That's a cube.
So that sounds like a cube to me, to my mind.
One thing I would say is, with the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths as it's sometimes referred, on the seventh day the Jews circumambulated 7 times. So there's another link.
Yes, they do. Well anticipated. So, there's one more temple though before we leave. Not the second temple, which I don't know if the dimensions are given in the Bible. One has to ask somebody who knows the Bible a little better than I do. But Ezekiel has a vision of a mystical temple. He goes up to heaven and he gazes upon a temple the mysterious otherworldly temple. And as he measures the length of the inner sanctuary, he realized it was 20 cubits. The length of the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits, and its width was 20 cubits across the end of the main hall. And he said to me, this God says to him, this is the most holy place. Now, technically, you could say that's only a square. It's not a cube, but the dimensions are the same as those given in Solomon's temple, and it would take a fairly small leap of imagination to imagine that it's 20 cubits high as well.
Yeah.
For any more information on that, ask Islam Critiqued. I'm sure he'll. I'm sure he'll know. He knows all about mystical temples.
Yeah.
Right. Hajj pilgrimage. In Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 16, it says, 3 times a year, every male amongst you, this is the Israelites, shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. And then it lists the 3 times at the feast of the unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, and the feast of booths. Nobody shall appear before the Lord empty-handed, but each of you will, with as much as he can give in proportion to the blessings which Lord your God has bestowed upon you. Well, in Hebrew, or in Israel, in Jewish tradition, these 3 feasts are called, I can't pronounce that. Do you want to have a go?
Well, I'm not too sure if it's pronounced Hag or Hajj, but yeah.
You see the link. It
Yeah.
is so similar to the Hajj.
It is. What I will say is I spoke to Leon Perez, the Jewish author, recently, and he does make the link between Hajj and this Jewish or Hebrew word. So I think he pronounced it Hag, but I could be wrong. It might be pronounced the same as Hajj. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check on that one.
But even if there is a difference between a hard G and a soft G, it can't be a coincidence that these 3 feasts are called the Hajj Hamasot, which is the Passover, the Hajj Sabuot, the Feast of Weeks, and the Hajj Hasukot, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths.
Yeah. Excellent.
As is, I think, fairly well known, at the Feast of the Passover, there is a sacrifice of a goat to reflect the Passover as the Jews were freed from captivity in Egypt. And as you pointed out, at the Feast of Weeks, the Mishnah Sukkah prescribes circling the temple once on each of the first 6 days of the Hajj Sabuot, and then 7 times on the 7th day. So you have the 2 elements there of animal sacrifice and circumambulation.
Excellent.
Number 4, the house of God. We've seen that the Quran refers to it many times, this place, as the house, the ancient house, the sacred house, the forbidden house, and so on. Well, the Bible also refers to its temple as the house of God, more times than one could count. I've created a little scroll here, so I can stop talking for a moment and let you read all the instances in which the Old Testament mainly, although also once the New Testament, Jesus quoting the Old Testament, refers to the temple as the house of God.
Yeah, it's quite a lot, isn't it?
We should have some music playing for this.
Yeah, wow.
I thought of Our House by Madness. Right,
It would be surprising if Islam didn't pick up on that name for the temple, or for the Masjid Al Haran, the house of God.
So there you are, finally, Jesus quoting Isaiah, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den." So if we wait a moment, here are all the references that I've given, if anyone wants to take a screenshot and look them all up. And here are all the many references to the house of God, house of Lord, and so on. And the fifth element is Bakar. I don't think I need to dwell on this because people who've probably made it this far will be well familiar that that when Surah 3 verse 96 refers to established for mankind at Bakar, this has been linked to Psalm 84. Happy are those who dwell in your house. Again, happy the men whose strength you are. Their hearts are set upon the pilgrimage. When they pass through the valley of Bakar, they make a spring of it. The early rain clothes it with a generous growth. They go from strength to strength, and they shall see the God of gods in Zion.
Very good link there.
Even I could probably figure out that this is a pilgrimage hymn. This is something that people sing on their pilgrimage, going to God's house in Jerusalem on Temple Mount through the valley of Bakar.
Yeah, excellent.
So, when we refers back to the traditional Islamic narrative, and one sees that these are all stories that are written down hundreds of years after the Quran, and where the narrative is, I think, clearly being framed to explain why this is in Mecca. It all sounds a bit artificial. Nothing's really explained in terms that really ties into anything else. So we'll put that to one side. Compare that with the same tests in relation to Temple Mount, and we have seen that the temple is frequently referred to in the Old Testament as God's house. We've seen that the Holy of Holies was a cube. We've seen that the Bakar is a symbolic, or the name Bakar is symbolic of the pilgrimage route to Jerusalem. We have seen that the Jerusalem temple was built on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had constructed an altar. So that's quite close to foundations raised by Abraham. You will note that the son has changed from Ishmael to Isaac. But if you're prepared to have me back, I'd love to do a presentation just on that. I could talk for an hour just upon the upon how the Quran treats the binding of Isaac. Abraham settled his progeny nearby. Well, he certainly did, because Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish nation, a traditional and cultural capital, and now once again. We've seen that the Hajj pilgrimage was mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 16, animals sacrificed at their Passover, and indeed, rather topically, because this is being recorded the day after Eid al-Adha, the modern Hajj concludes with an animal sacrifice of Eid, celebrating Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son.
I like the fact that the timing of the making of this video couldn't have been better, and that wasn't intentional by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, what's actually curious here is that the Passover sacrifice is not really connected to Jerusalem at all. That commemorates events that took place in Egypt, when the Jews are being freed from slavery under the Pharaoh. So actually, the modern Islamic Hajj is closer to the Jerusalem temple than the Feast of the Passover.
Yeah,
But they both have the common theme of sacrificing poor lamb there.
Yeah.
And circumambulation, as I've said, is a feature of the Jewish vows. On rituals of Safa and Marwa, I can't completely put a green tick next to this. I've put an orange squiggle. I wonder if Marwa might be a Islamic or an Arabic form of Moriah, the mountain. That's as close as I got there. I haven't completely explained that cryptic verse. I wouldn't claim to. However, when one looks at what the Quran tells us about this place, I think it is every fact, every name it tells us about can be linked to the Jewish temple. There's nothing I've left out here. Well, the forbidden place of prostration I'll come on to. But everything here, everything that the Quran tells us can be justified in terms of the Old Testament, in terms of what was already there centuries before the Quran was written, not stories that are written down centuries after the Quran to fit it. Okay, I'll hand over to, sorry, no, this first section, I've missed out a slide. Okay. Is it so unusual that the Quran, or so odd, that the Quran would focus its landscape on the Jewish temple? Would that be a surprising thing? I would say not at all. A large part of the Quran is devoted to telling biblical stories, mostly from the Old Testament. There's some New Testament stories there, but overwhelmingly the Quran author's interest is in Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Lot and so on. And these stories are told again and again and again throughout the Quran. It's obviously a big thing for the Quran author. It repeatedly confirms the Torah and the Gospel, and not quite so often, but it does. And it applies aspects of Mosaic law, for example, prohibiting the eating of swine, and my mind has gone blank. But there are plenty of aspects. Lex talionis, the eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth, which is in the Torah, also finds its way into the Quran. The Quran author clearly has detailed knowledge of the Bible, but he also has detailed knowledge of rabbinic writings. There are many quotes from Jewish writings that are not in the Bible. And as Islamic Critiqued has pointed out on several videos, the author of the Quran also knew a great deal about Jewish mysticism. I would suggest that the man who wrote the Quran, is obviously a man, was fascinated. He wasn't a Jew, but he was absolutely fascinated by the Old Testament and the story of the Israelites. And some verses of the Quran are specifically addressed to the children of Israel, and I've given a list of verses there. So I would suggest that it is not in the least bit surprising that the Quran should place its geographical focus, its spiritual focus, on the Jerusalem temple. What would be odd is that it attached all this importance to a pagan shrine in the Hijaz. Okay.
Okay, so that was fantastic. I think in terms of my most recent research in particular, what you're saying is very much in line with that. A big part of what I'm discovering of late is a strong Iraqi connection, which you might think, well, what's this got to do with Jerusalem? But the Jews were living in Babylon and Surah along the Euphrates. And so the sources that you see in the Quran are pretty much from Jewish schools and academies, these Jewish mysticism stories, rabbinical writings. This is where you would find them. I also think that your case for Jerusalem being the original Mecca, or the original focus for the Hajj, is very strong. I think all of the connections that you made really build a really strong picture. And if you compare that with Mecca, there's no case to be answered, because like there's literally nothing in the landscape or the history of the location of Mecca as we know it in the Hijaz that would connect it or give a reason for that being a place of pilgrimage. It's literally a blank slate in the desert. So that's my initial reaction. I'm sure there's other things that occurred to me as we're going through it. I think the idea of the Feast of Booths and how the Holy of Holies was a cube, which was a detail I wasn't aware of. I was curious to know more about the hut that they built as well as part of this feast. But you know, the fact that it was a cube in shape supports the idea of it being the Kaaba. And also the idea that the Jews originally circumambulated 7 times on the 7th day. It seems like what I will term the Abrahamists, before we can call them, I suppose, Muslims, they were borrowing a lot of their ideas from the Jews. They were like the imitators of the Jews for centuries. So I can totally buy the idea of Jerusalem being the real Masjid Al Haran.
And to imagine it's a coincidence, to imagine that it was somewhere else, and that Muhammad was announcing that God had a house, that God had claimed somewhere as a house, and it had been built by Abraham, and it was a cube shape, and it was somewhere that he wanted people to circumambulate, and it was a place where you should have sacrifices, and it was associated with Bakar. To imagine that all that was completely independent, and then and none of the Jews pointed this out, and none of the Jews that he was addressing in the verses that you see on the screen, is just impossible. Any Jew, particularly at that time when they had the temple, of course, modern Judaism has sees the temple as a historical thing. But for those people, when the temple seemed a lot closer to them, it's incredible that, or it's unimagiable that all these things happened independently. That it was just a coincidence, and of course a theological problem. The Quran confirms the Torah, so the Quran confirms that God's house is in Mount Moriah in Canaan, and it confirms that that they should be cube shaped and so on. So what explanation is there for it being anywhere else? Is it God's second house? Did God move house? Does God have 2 houses? And the Quran never attempts to explain this. Yeah. And I think the only explanation is that the Quran was talking about Jerusalem. I cannot see how. I'd love to see a Muslim come along and try to explain how it could be a coincidence, how there could be 2 God's houses and not be mentioned.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the Quran, where it was written and what it is focused on are 2 distinct things. The book may have been written about Jerusalem in this case, but it doesn't necessarily mean the Quran was written in Jerusalem. Sometimes.
I'll move on to that. That brings me to the second point.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to kind of jump ahead to something that you may talk about later, but the other thing I would say is, you know, Petra is one of the places that people think was the original Mecca, and Murad on the channel reckons that there was some place in Iraq that was the contender for the early Mecca. But based on the evidence I see here today in your PowerPoint, I would say that the strongest candidate, as far as I know up to this moment in time, and I may change my mind, but I can't see how I would say the strongest candidate would be Jerusalem, as you argue. I think that makes the most logical sense. With the other candidates, Petra and say a place in Iraq, the evidence isn't very obvious. It's very circumstantial at best. So, for example, with Petra, you could look at some of the details of how it's described and say, yes, there was loamy soil there, or there's olive trees growing there. Okay, that sounds a bit like Petra. But that's not really a strong case, particularly considering Petra was primarily a pagan site rather than a Jewish site. So I think your case is strong.
I'm a big fan of Dan Gibson. I think he's right to an extent. I think he's completely persuaded me that the Petra was the Mecca described in Ibn Ishaq's book. I think Ibn Ishaq went to Petra, and he in his mind he put the events of Mecca there, the description of the valleys and the watercourse and the upper and the lower entries.
Yeah.
I think that's true, but Ibn Ishaq was writing 120 years after, I would say, after the Quran was written, and I think Ibn Ishaq was imagining these events taking place there.
There's also,
if you're a writer, you write about somewhere you imagine. If you want to write something, you would go somewhere, and then you would place your story in that place.
Absolutely. The other thing is that by the time Ibn Ishaq was writing, the establishment, the regime, may not have wanted to remember the Jewish connection in all of this.
Absolutely.
They might have wanted to distance themselves from that. And so Petra might have been a better location, particularly because it's associated with mostly Arabs down through the centuries rather than, and it's the capital of the Nabatean region as well, which would have been a private place for the Arabs. So if you imagine when, say, from the time of Al-Walid, there was a definite shift towards Arab nation or the Arab culture and so on, then it would make more sense to kind of try and build a story that focused more on the Arabs themselves and not depend so much on the Jewish heritage. So to kind of mark their own story out, it was important not to be just using Jewish locations for their own story.
Right.
Now.
The Masjid Al Haran is the Temple Mount, possibly part 2. Now, it occurs to me some people may just want their memory refreshing on the Abraham story. So let's just very quickly recap this. Abraham was married to Sarah, or Sarai to begin with. She changed her name to Sarah. God makes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and 13. And God promises Abraham that his descendants will become as numerous as the stars in the sky, a great nation, and they will possess land. He promises Abraham that his descendants will occupy the land from the Wadi of Egypt to the Great River. Not quite sure which great river. I would assume Jordan would be the obvious one, but some people are more ambitious and claim the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Oh yeah, I was going to say the Euphrates, but yeah, maybe that's Jordan might be probably as far as they would have thought of.
Well, Abraham is a very old man at this time, and he and Sarah are childless, and so she has formed the view that she's barren, and she suggests that Abraham gives God a helping hand in fulfilling this oath by sleeping with Sarah's housemaid Hagar, and which he does, and Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Then God appears to Abraham again, this time in the form of three visitors, and he tells them that Sarah will in fact give birth to a son, and this comes to pass, and Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And then in one of the many episodes of the Old Testament that strikes me as a bit harsh, a bit unfair, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. Sarah says, "We don't need you here anymore," and Hagar is banished with Ishmael, which seems a really rough deal for her. Isaac, in his turn, has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, also known as Israel. Esau sells Jacob his birthright for a mess of pottage, and Jacob then has 12 sons who, as we all know from Joseph and his technical dream coat, they all move to Egypt at the end, and there, over the centuries, the generations, they become enslaved by the Egyptians, and centuries later are led to freedom by Moses. And Moses, whilst they're in the wilderness, gives them the law and forms them into a community. It is a tradition that the Arabs regard themselves as descended from Ishmael, and they often refer to themselves, or are referred to, as Ishmaelites. Okay, is that about accurate?
It is, yeah,
Yep.
very accurate. I suppose one other thing you could say is the alternative name that they give themselves is Hagarenes, or if I can remember the other one, the Maghreb in Syriac, which is a similar concept of being sent away.
Right. In the Quran, Abraham is described on a number of occasions. I have to count them there, about nine occasions, as a Hanif. Now, the word Hanif means, literally, apparently it means heathen, but it's understood by Muslims and non-Muslims as a reference to a pure monotheism. So Abraham, he knew God, he spoke with God, he walked with God, and he had the purest form of monotheism without any of the attachments that came with later Jewish history. So that's the way.
It sounds to me it's almost conveys the idea of primordial religion.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So all the business about the wandering in the wilderness, and the Ten Commandments, and then the Babylonian captivity, and the Maccabees, and all this comes later and forms what would have been Judaism in the time of the Quran. But the Quran refers to Abraham as a pure monotheist, and it uses the word Hanif to communicate this. And Muhammad sees himself in the role of Moses, the prophet, the scribe, the lawgiver, and the nation founder for the children of Ishmael. Again, this isn't going out on a limb here. I think most Muslims would agree that Muhammad acts in the role of Moses in those four ways. And in many times in the Quran, he seems to do. It talks about the Quran being on a tablet, and the Quran includes two passages that are very similar to in style to the Ten Commandments. And he seems, and yet he's confirming. He confirms that the Torah is still valid for the children of Israel. So this can only be him setting out a different but parallel system for himself.
Yeah.
Yep. Right, so this is where I'm going to ask Mel to do a little bit of reading to give my voice a rest. This is an extract from the Armenian Chronicle of Pseudo-Sebios. It's called Pseudo-Sebios because he wrote this chronicle in the name of Sebios, but we know it wasn't the real Bishop Sebios, so I've drawn him there as a scribe holding a mask in front of his face. This is very old. This is a chronicle of events, and the chronicle comes to an end with the last event in 660 or 661, and presumably that's either when he ran out of ink or paper, or where for whatever reason the chronicle comes to an end. So this is only 30 years. It's only 28 years after the traditional death of Muhammad. This is very, very recent. I would say I would say Muhammad lived quite a bit later. So it's very close to the time of the events in question.
Okay.
Sorry. No, I misspoke. I'll go on for this slide and then cue you in.
Okay.
Pseudo-Sebios is very interesting because he's one of the few people who describes in detail the Byzantine-Sasanian War between 602 and 628. During that war, the Byzantine authorities in Jerusalem surrender the city to the Sasanians, and Sebios describes that thereafter the Christians and the Jews fall to fighting. He says, the remnants of the Hebrew people, this is Jews who are living in Jerusalem, rebelled against the Christians, and manifesting a desire for a homeland, wrought a very damaging slaughters amongst a multitude of believers. This makes a lot of sense. If the Jews have been persecuted by the Christians for centuries, they long to have their homeland back, and to rebuild their temple, and the Christians won't let them. And then Byzantium is invaded by the Sasanians, who are all Zoroastrians, or they're led by Zoroastrians. It's very easy to imagine how the Jews in Jerusalem would say, this is our chance. We'll kick out the Christians, we'll come to a deal with the Sasanians, and we can have our homeland back again. This is an opportunity that only comes around every 500 years. This needs to be seized. I find that very, very plausible.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, the plan goes wrong. The Christians prevail, massacring many Jews, and Eusebius describes very vividly the remainder of the Jews jumped from the walls and went to the Iranian as a Sasanian army. When Heraclius eventually triumphs, when he comes through Armenia, he has this surprise attack. He sends his army not to recapture the territory that is lost, but he sends the army through Armenia to attack the Sasanian homeland. And he forces Khusro II to surrender the territories that he's seized. He compels all the Jews throughout the Byzantine Empire to convert to Christianity, or presumably leave, in return for their treachery against him. There's not a huge amount of historical support for this, either for or against it, but this account seems entirely plausible with the political situation. Would you agree?
I would, and I know you're going to refer to the Doctrina Jacobi, which is contemporary with that time, and that forms the backdrop to that account. So it does support this historical. Absolutely,
yes. Yes, the Doctrina Jacobi wouldn't exist if there weren't forcible conversions of Jews. Yes. Yeah. Right. So now I hand over to Mel, who's going to read this and the following slide.
Okay. So the Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship they had through the books of the Old Testament. Although the Arabs were convinced of their close relationship, they were unable to get a consensus from their multitude, for they were divided from each other by religion. In that period, a certain one of them, a man of the sons of Ishmael named Muhammad, became prominent. A sermon about the way of truth, supposedly at God's command, was revealed to them, and Muhammad taught them to recognize the God of Abraham, especially since he was informed and knowledgeable about Mosaic history. Because the command had come from on high, he ordered them all to assemble together and to unite in faith, abandoning the reverence of vain things, to turn towards the living God who had appeared to their father Abraham.
Thank you very much. So the Jews have been kicked out of the Byzantine Empire. They've been forced to convert to Christianity or leave, and some of them, presumably the more devout, the more religiously zealous, have left, and they're wandering, and they've called the Arabs to their aid and said, "Look how close we are. You're the children of Ishmael. We're the children of Israel. We're distant relatives." And then, according to Eusebius, who, as I say, is writing 20 or 30 years after the event in question, he says a man called Muhammad from the Arabs came forward and started preaching a sermon so that the Arabs would recognize the God of Abraham. And so he's forming a community consisting of the Arabs and the Jews, I would say. Right, I wonder if you could take us on another page.
Okay, then all of them assembled together from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, and they set out from the Paran Desert, being 12 tribes moving in the order of precedence of the houses of the patriarchs of their tribe. They were divided into 12,000 men, of which the sons of Israel were in their own tribes, 1,000 to a tribe, to lead them to the country of Israel. They reached Moabite Rabat at the borders of Reuben's land. The Byzantine army was encamped in Arabia. The Arabs fell upon them suddenly, struck them with the sword, and put to flight Emperor Heraclius' brother Theodotus. Oh no, what was it? Theodos?
Yes, I'm quite sure.
Yes.
So according to Pseudo-Sebius, having formed a community, built up a religion in which the Arabs are recognizing their heritage as the children of Ishmael, distant relatives of the children of Israel. He's now leading them into battle. He's divided 12,000 men. That's clearly a
symbolic number.
Symbolic. Yeah, thank you. A symbolic number because there were the 12 tribes of Israel from the 12 sons of Jacob. So that's obviously the numbers are a bit too perfect to be accurate, but you can see what is going on. So it's my overall thesis is an awful lot of the Quran can be seen as trying to embed the Old Testament into an Arab culture, and then the second part, also traditionally called the Medinan verses, leading the resulting army in war and against the Holy Land, trying to recapture the Masjid Al Haran, which of course I would say is Jerusalem. So, what's really going on? We've got a bit more evidence to look at. You see here a map of the Middle East with Jerusalem, Yathrib, and Mecca marked on it. The Quran once, on one occasion, Surah 33, verse 13, refers to its community as being the people of Yathrib, which is the old name of Medina. And this gets some confirmation in a document called the Constitution of Medina, which also mentions Yathrib and mentions Muhammad, and interestingly, seems to support the idea that there are Jews living in and amongst Arab tribes. It's the Constitution of Medina has a set of rules that the different tribes that sign up to it must abide by, and then it goes on to say, and the Jews of this tribe, and the Jews of that tribe, and the Jews of another tribe, as though the Jews are scattered amongst or not scattered, they are embedded within the Arab community. So the Constitution of Medina does actually support the account of Pseudo-Sebius. And there's no problem with Yathrib existing. So Yathrib, we know that exists. That has none of the problems of Mecca, because that's mentioned by Ptolemy in his geography. So we know that was existing for centuries beforehand. Flag there. Now, I have a bit of a pet theory about a city called Ayla or Aqaba. So, Ayla or Aqaba is up here on the Gulf of Aqaba, and ruins of signs, traces of an ancient mosque have been found there. It's kind of interesting. It's very interesting, but it's particularly interesting, I would say, because its Qibla appears, from the people who carried out the archaeological excavation, to point to Mount Sinai. If this was correct, this would make it the only mosque that pointed to Mount Sinai, which may suggest that it was the first mosque, possibly. I know that Dan Gibson disputes this. He thinks it was pointing, because we don't really have a prayer niche, it could be pointing to the southwest to Mount Sinai, or it could be pointing to the northeast towards Petra. We don't really know. But I like to imagine, bit of a flight of fancy, that this is where all the Muslims were praying to Mount Sinai, because that was where Muhammad was for some reason wanted them to pray towards. And then that was where the Jews came and pledged allegiance to him. They all turned around and started praying in the opposite direction, which of course is the story of the changing of the Qibla, which I've never seen convincingly explained by anybody. Also, Ibn Ishaq refers to some people pledging their allegiance to Muhammad as the Pledge of Aqaba. He talks about the first and the second Pledge of Aqaba. And it's a coincidence of names. I don't myself attach colossal importance to a similarity of a name, but it just seems to fit. It's possible, it's not proven, but it's possible that this was a base of Muhammad, and they were all praying, and the Jews came down. That was where they pledged their allegiance to him, the Pledge of Aqaba. They all turn around and start praying to Jerusalem. Then they all go south to Yathrib, and that's where their base, and that's where they form the army, and they train, and they get ready for their battle. What is not speculation is the first reference that we have to Muhammad. The first historical reference that we have to Muhammad outside the Quran is a record by a priest known as Thomas the Presbyter, who makes a note in his chronicle, in his diary, that on the 9th of February 634 there was a battle in Gaza between the Romans and the Tayyi of Muhammad, and he describes that the Romans are defeated and the Tayyi then ravaged the whole region. I think you have this is of particular interest for you, because you've got some you have your information about the Tayyi.
Yeah, I would argue that the Tayyi are the real historical tribe that the person that we call Muhammad belonged to. But they were located in the, let me see, in the Lakhmid area and part of the Ghaznid area. It's basically the Transjordan area is primarily where they were located. So a lot of the points that you've made here about Kaaba and Yathrib and so on, I would put that as part of the later tradition when the story got sent through the mixer. Whereas the further you go back in the sources, the further north everything appears to be. As you go through the later sources, things start heading south when they were trying to make everything fit around Mecca. That's my take on it. But yeah, the other thing I would say is the Quraysh is a later mistake in the tradition. The word appears in their sources, and they have assumed that this is a tribe that Muhammad belonged to. But my research would suggest that Quraysh is actually the Babylonian Aramaic word for Cyrus. That's how you said Cyrus in that language, which is very close to Hebrew and very close to Arabic. So actually, when the Qurayshi are referred, essentially what is being referred to is the Iraqi people. And the other thing I would kind of differ on this, hopefully I'm not being too controversial here, is that in Sebi's account, when the Jews are expelled from Edessa, the place that they meet Muhammad was, in fact, let me see if I can say it right, Tajikistan, which is in northern Mesopotamia, which again would be further north. So that would be the big area I would probably differ, but it's no harm for everyone to hear the different options, and people can make up their own minds on that.
One factor I think we agree on is that Muhammad was of the Tayyi. You would agree with me on this because of your discovery of Ibn Kabash, and here we've got Thomas a presbyter, and maybe this was a late forgery. It seems an odd thing to be a late forgery, but he'd be writing in 634, saying that Muhammad of the Tayyi, which fits the idea that Muhammad was a member of the Tayyi, was active and fighting battles in Gaza.
In fact, I would kind of go further with that. I read it, maybe I'm interpreting it a certain way, but I get the impression that it's suggesting Muhammad wasn't just a member of the tribe, but the leader of the tribe. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's how you read it, but there's a danger when we read things, we might interpret too much out of the text. But for me, it seems like it's suggesting that he was the tribal leader.
A lot of people seem to imagine the Quran. They read the Quran and they can't make any sense of it. And you get a lot of people saying that the Quran is gibberish, it's nonsense. This is some person who doesn't know what he's talking about. The more I read it, the more I see in it, and this is not nonsense. I think that whoever wrote the Quran was extremely educated in a wide range of sources, and is perfectly consistent with him being part of a royal family or some very affluent and privileged person to have spent all that time reading books, and then to come out and read and form an army. I think he doesn't certainly sounds like an elite kind of guy.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think if I'm reading you correctly, I don't think you would go with the idea of him being an illiterate orphan.
No, not at all. No.
That bit I think is totally implausible. But I do think it makes more sense for him to be from a privileged background, because then he has a voice that people are willing to follow, and that, you know, like in the way Sebius talks about him ordering people to come together, like that fits with someone who's kingly.
Yes, but not necessarily a king, because a lot of the Quran, the early verses of the Quran, tell a very human story of a man preaching and being ridiculed and mocked and insulted, and he seems very alone. It talks about his depression quite a lot. There are dozens of verses in the Quran in which God reassures him not to be depressed, not to be downcast. So he's not. It doesn't sound like a king in a palace. He sounds like he's out there on the street trying to win people over to his religious ideas, and he's not having much success. And that seems to go on for quite a long time. So I don't necessarily have him down as a king, but he's sufficiently privileged that he's read all these books, and then he's obviously